The early 80s were a special time for music because not only did you see the emergence of some really good heavy metal, but you also had an abundance of really good hard rock music. Tonight, we're going to celebrate some of the best hard rock you've ever heard, and we're going to take a look at something rather unusual. Heavy metal, the movie? Find out all about it next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Today we are going through the year 1981. And in particular, we're going to take a look at some of the best hard rock that's ever been created in the history of music. The early 80s were fantastic because starting in 1980, in particular, you had the new wave of British heavy metal, and you started seeing such great metal moving forward throughout the entire decade. Whereas the 70s had some of the best hard rock ever performed, and it was still in its heyday, although it starts to peter out in a couple of years. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. The heavy metal is great, the hard rock is great. Today we're going to take a look at the hard rock, in particular the best hard rock songs going. And let me tell you, I say this every week probably, but the competition this week was ridiculous. At one point, I had like a dozen songs that I wanted to squeeze into those 5 nominees. So there's going to be some great songs that are left off the list. Probably do a couple honorable mentions just to make sure you know where those songs stand. But before we get to that, one of the most unusual chapters in heavy metal history happens right here in 1981. In that, we make a movie. Heavy Metal the Movie comes out in 1981, and we're going to talk about not really the movie. The movie was pretty subpar, but has one of the most interesting soundtracks you're ever going to hear. Very eclectic, very different, and I have a feeling that this is one of those things that's kind of been buried over time. So as we're going through 50 plus years of heavy metal, I thought I'd unearth this, see if there's anything here that might interest you. So without further ado, let's go talk about the soundtrack to heavy metal. All right, let's first dispel where this movie came from. It's technically not about heavy metal music. There was a magazine that came out, I believe, in 1977 called Heavy Metal Magazine. It was basically a fantasy magazine where people would illustrate dudes with muscles and swords and big-breasted women in leather with swords or ray guns or whatever. There was a lot of ass kicking, a lot of boobs, teenage boys' delight, and some of the best illustrations you're ever going to see. Really had some great artists coming through those doors. Now, ironically, the heavy metal movie, while based on this magazine, had very little of, the big-breasted, women kicking ass, and it was mostly about a green orb that's floating through the universe, causing destruction. I guess you could say the little green orb was like the devil, I guess. But anyway, wherever it went, chaos ensued, death ensued, whatever. And at the end of the movie, the Valkyrie, who is really the only, prominent female in this, rides into a volcano to destroy it, but I think it survives somehow, some way. It's kind of one of those movies. Not very good. But believe it or not, it attracted so much attention that some of the most prominent directors and producers across the spectrum have wanted to do various remakes of this. I would imagine at one point we'll probably see a sequel. There's been kind of parts sequeled. Apparently there's a Netflix show called For the Love of Robots, something of that nature. But anyway, this was, really the artistic crowd's, baby for a long time. Now, I thought the illustrations in the movie, the drawings weren't all that great compared to what was in the magazine, and the movie itself was pretty forgettable. Now, just a couple of notes on the movie before we move on. It does have a few famous celebrities, as voice actors in it, at least ones that I recognize. Of course, you would know the great, legendary John Candy of, several great movies. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, probably his best. Uncle Buck, the list. Also Harold Ramis, famous sidekick to Bill Murray in movies like Stripes, and the writer of Groundhog Day, very funny man. And Eugene Levy, who is, of course, famous for American Pie, Schitt's Creek, that crew. So a lot of those SCTV Canadian comedians were in this as voice actors. Pretty interesting little cast there. But we're not going to talk about the movie. It was a terrible movie. Apparently it made money. Apparently it was very chic around the director's coffee talk, But as far as just a fan of the movie, nah, I didn't really like it. It's what I call a drive-in movie. Back in the day, this may be something for younger fans or people from outside the States. We had drive-in movies. It was a big way to watch movies back in that day. And essentially, instead of going into a theater to watch the movie, you would drive your car in and put a speaker in the window or turn your radio in the car to a certain frequency and listen to the movie in your car. But if you were at the drive-in, chances are, A, you were with a girl and you want a little privacy to make out, or B, you're with your buddies imbibing on different activities, drinking and the like, and you weren't really paying attention to the movie. This is kind of one of those movies. Not really something that you would pay attention to at ye old drive-in. But anyway, that's just a little bit of backstory on the movie itself. But what's really interesting about this was the soundtrack that was produced, because it really has quite a strange mix of artists. So let's go through it track by track, and maybe there's some songs on here that you may find interesting. Now, I will put a disclaimer in. Although I have the CD for this, if you've been watching my episodes, I'm not going to go dig it out just for this. So I'm using the set list that's on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia notes that depending on who released the CD or the album or whatever, the track listing can be slightly changed. So I'm going with the Wikipedia set. Track number 1, Sammy Hagar with the song Heavy Metal. Now, Sammy Hagar, at this point in his career, is not really a household name. He's just on the verge of becoming a big star. Of course, he was the lead singer for Montrose for many years, but that kind of got, scuttled pretty quick. He's been a solo artist for a while. He's known at this point as the Red Rocker. He had the song Red, etc. But he's just about to break big with this album, Standing Hampton. And I was just looking on Spotify, and they have this as his number 1 most viewed song. So this was a pretty big hit for him, and it really started his solo career to really boom after this. So as we look at these artists, everybody seems to be in a little bit different position. Sammy Hagar's just on the verge of stardom, and of course, in 4 or 5 years, he's going to join Van Hagar, and the next thing you know, he's distributing tequila out of Cabo Wabo, and one of the most recognized celebrities in the world. So this is right there at the beginning of Sammy Hagar's ascent, and it actually one of the better songs on this, and one of the few songs that you could be considered heavy metal. As we'll go through this, you'll realize there's not a lot of heavy metal on the heavy metal movie. This would probably be one of them. The opening track is a good one. Go look it up. Heavy Metal by Sammy Hagar, also appearing on his solo album, Standing Hampton. Now this is when it gets a little strange, because the 2nd and 9th track on this album are from a band by the name of Riggs, and their 2 songs, Heartbeat and Radar Rider. Now why is this strange? Because up to that point, no one had ever heard of Riggs. At least I hadn't. I don't believe they had any albums out. They're kind of a 2-hit wonder, and these are the 2 hits. How this director producer found this band and promoted these two songs, probably one of those mysteries. Probably something that the label was trying to push. They had a new band out. Anyway, Riggs never really makes it. The guitarist goes on to Pat Travers and others down the road. And basically, Riggs is just one of those bands that kind of disappears into time. Oh, they put out a single here or there, but never were amount to anything. So unlike Sammy Hagar, who was a known artist, these guys are relatively unknown. And I will say that these two tracks are amongst my favorite on the whole album. So whatever reason they were included, I'm glad they were included because they are excellent. Heartbeat's good, Radar Riders even better. If you've never heard the heavy metal soundtrack, if this is all new information to you, this would be a place where I would start. The two Riggs songs are very good, and again, very unusual because this band came out of nowhere and quickly went back to nowhere, back into obscurity for the band Riggs. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this soundtrack is very eclectic. So our opening track could be considered heavy metal. The second track and the ninth track, this obscure band plays some pretty good hard rock. I think we're still pretty much what we expect here. But the third track is from a band by the name of Devo, who's working in a coal mine. Now, Devo is a punk band who was really made popular by a video they put out. Remember, this is the early 80s, so MTV rules the lands. And they put out an album called Whip It, where the band is seen running around wearing flower pots on their heads and taking a bullwhip to some senorita and slowly but surely knocking the cigarette out, taking articles of clothing off. Very strange band. I would say, I looked them up, Devo's still around, probably have a following, but from my perspective, this was kind of a one album wonder that was made popular by a very bizarre music video. And this is the first song that you're like, this isn't hard rock, this isn't heavy metal, this is kind of a weird punk song. And as far as I could tell, I looked around, it seems like Devo made this song for this movie. I don't see it in any of their other albums. So again, it seems odd. Producers were finding obscure bands, and now they're going into the punk world and saying, hey, Devo, want to produce a song for this? And this is what they came up with. It's not a bad song, but it's not for me. This is one of the weaker tracks on the album, I would say. But if you are a fan of kind of punk and new age, I wouldn't say that they don't have the attitude of punk, right? They've kind of got that pop punk, if you will, where they're definitely a very catchy band. And yeah, you got to go check out that video with the flower pots. They're a strange bunch, but they end up on the heavy metal soundtrack, working in a coal mine. Now, the fourth track on this album, we finally are going to run into a big act, Blue Oyster Cult, and their song, Veteran of 1,000 Psychic Wars. This is also on the Fire of Unknown Origin album. Now, Blue Oyster Cult, if you've been on this channel a bit, you know they were a big band in the 70s. This is one of the kind of hard rock legends of the 70s that kind of leaks into the 80s a couple of years, but then kind of disappears a little bit out of the popular mainstream. Blue Oyster Cult, I believe, still around as well. They were always a little bit too eccentric, a little bit too, say, progressive for me, but they have the great hits, and they have some great rockers. It seemed like every album they had at least one song that I adored, but I really never got into a lot of their deeper tracks. So you have your big hits. We may be talking about this one here in a few minutes. Burning for You. We have Don't Fear the Reaper, an award winner from a couple of years ago. You have Godzilla. You have a couple of really good rockers like Red and Black and Cities on Flame. But once you get out of those big, heavy tracks, it's not for me generally. But I would say this is more along the lines of a deeper track and one that I really love. This is one of the best songs on this album. Veteran of a Thousand Psychic Wars is perfect for this album. It kind of brings a little bit of heaviness to it. It brings out all those eccentrics of Blue Oyster Cult, who often delved into fantasy and outer space and all these things. So this is a pretty cool track. Again, this is on their album Fire of Unknown Origin. I would say this is kind of the last big album for Blue Oyster Cult. This is probably the last big song of theirs, as they kind of start to fade away after this. So you have, on one hand, you got Sammy Hagar coming up. On Blue Oyster Cult, you're kind of seeing them kind of ride off into the sunset. I saw them live right about this time. They were on tour with Rainbow, I think about a year after this. And I will just say, Blue Oyster Cult, I think, really made their name through their live performances. Buck Dharma, in particular, one of the most underrated guitarists in the history of rock and metal. He was on, competing with Ritchie Blackmore that night and held his own. Very impressive. They have a string of live albums. If you're interested in pursuing, what's this Blue Oyster Cult all about, I would start with their live albums. They've got some great ones. On Your Feet and On Your Knees, Some Enchanted Evenings, very good. And right after this, they kind of put out their last big double live album, Extraterrestrial Live. A band worth taking a peek at, for sure. Now, several bands have 2 songs on this soundtrack. We talked about Riggs earlier. Now we're going to talk about Cheap Trick, who, much like Blue Oyster Cult, was a really big band in the 70s that was kind of had hit their commercial peak. Right about here, they start to fade off a little bit. And again, Cheap Trick's still around, still touring, really great music. Again, more probably hard rock than metal for sure. Rick Nielsen, great guitarist. Robin Zanders, a fantastic lead vocalist. Really good band. But they have a song by the name of Reach Out and You Must Be Dreaming to Think I Love You. 2 songs. And again, these songs don't appear anywhere else that I've noticed in the Cheap Trick collection. So these songs were made specifically for this movie, and they're both very good. Much like Blue Oyster Cult, they got their big break in the 70s with a live album at Budokan, where they put out the infamous I Want You to Want Me. Interestingly enough, they made that live album specifically for their Japanese audience, where they were much bigger than in the States, and it was so good it broke worldwide. Then they had a string of hits, Dream Police, etc. But again, their commercial success, much like Blue Oyster Cult's, kind of hits right here and starts to fade off. So kind of an interesting mix of bands here that, and again, it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this album is because a lot of these bands really don't have much more after this. So I think this soundtrack kind of doesn't get the credit it deserves for interesting. Both Cheap Trick songs are very good. Check them out. Track 6 is another song called Heavy Metal, which is kind of embarrassing, I guess, when you go and, it's like that whole going to a cocktail party and you realize someone else has the same outfit you do. It's like, oh, how embarrassing. So it's Heavy Metal, Taking a Ride by Don Felder, who, of course, was a guitarist for many years for the Eagles. Just the fact that I bring up the Eagles lets you know this isn't really a heavy song at all. Maybe a little heavier than some of the Eagles stuff, but not even probably as hard as and heavy as some of the Joe Walsh stuff. So he also has 2 songs here. He has Heavy Metal, Taking a Ride, and All of You. Again, pretty good songs. Not heavy in the least. So if you're looking for heavy, I wouldn't go here. But if you're a fan of the Eagles, I don't think Don Felder did a lot outside of the Eagles and outside of this soundtrack. So it's kind of a nice little hidden gem for the Eagles fans out there. Check it out. Track 7 is an instrumental song by the name of True Companion by Donald Fagen. Donald Fagen, of course, from Steely Dan fame. Now, if you suffer from insomnia, I will direct you right here. Because Steely Dan, not because it's boring, but because it's mellow. You can't get more mellow than Steely Dan. They had a big hit back in the 70s, FM. They have some good ones, but trust me, they like make the Doobie Brothers seem heavy. These guys are very light. And so again, it's a very odd selection to put out a heavy metal soundtrack, and now you are in back-to-back songs going with the Eagles, or a member of the Eagles, and a member of Steely Dan, two very mellow songs in a row. So the energy in this album really starts to fade, probably after Cheap Trick for a bit. And this is like, I remember looking at the track listing and I was like, True Companion. I don't even remember this song. And it's totally forgettable. If you're not a fan of like really mellow music, you can just skip this one. Now you may be sensing a theme here, because we're about to talk about the third band that was huge in the 70s, but starting to fade out in the early 80s. One of my favorites, Nazareth, with the song Crazy, a suitable case for treatment. Dan McCafferty is one of my favorite singers of all time. He has the most gravelly voice in the history of rock and roll. I've never heard anybody sing like this man. Was a big fan of Nazareth. But let's be honest, if they had one of the best albums of the 70s, Hair of the Dog, but really just a few hits sprinkled here and there throughout the 70s, never really recaptured that moment. I think really the last album of theirs that was, pretty good was A Full Circle, and I think that was like 83. So much like these other bands we've been talking about, Nazareth has had their heyday, and they're about to start to wane on the commercially successful scale. But if you've never heard Nazareth, number one, I recommend this song, a pretty good song. But number two, go back in the collection and listen to Hair of the Dog. It is spectacular and really the highlight of their career. And just bask in the glory of Dan McCafferty's voice. Track 10 is from arguably the biggest band at the time, Journey, who had a big ballad back in the day by the name of Open Arms, still one of their biggest hits ever. Steve Perry at the height of his powers. Journey was in the early 80s. You're talking about one of the biggest bands on the planet. They participate here. So we have bands that are starting to get popular. You have bands that are popular is waning. This may be the band that has the biggest following at this time. But again, heavy metal. They play the softest Journey song you're ever going to find. It's a very sweet little ballad, but nothing that would make you think of their heavier stuff. You have the power of Neil Schoen's guitar. You have some really good, heavier songs in the Journey collection. But no. Once again, we're going mellow with Open Arms. But I would say, if you've never heard the song by Journey and you like a good ballad, check this one out. It is excellent. Track 11 is from the legendary 70s band Grand Funk Railroad, Queen Bee. Now this is another strange one, because we talk about bands that were waning in popularity. Grand Funk Railroad had broken up. They had split up, said adios, but they decided to get together, give it one more try, right? We need the money, whatever the case may be. And so they put out an album, Grand Funk Lives, right? The big comeback. And Queen Bee is off this one, and then it's off on the heavy metal soundtrack. But apparently Grand Funk didn't live, because they, again, broke up right after this again. So this is a band who's not obscure or not fading. They're completely off the radar, but they show up on the soundtrack. Queen Bee is a pretty good song. Grand Funk has some really good stuff in the early to mid 70s, probably their biggest hit being We're an American Band. Queen Bee is pretty good. Fits in on this album pretty well as well. So check it out. The Last Gasp of Grand Funk Railroad right here. At this point, you're probably asking yourself, Metal Dude, we've been talking about this heavy metal movie. We've been talking about this heavy metal soundtrack. But I don't see a lot of heavy metal. Some hard rock here and there. Maybe Blue Oyster Cult, maybe Sammy Hagar, but I don't hear a lot of heavy metal. Well, here you go. Track number 13, the legendary Black Sabbath with The Mob Rules. As you guys know, this is one of my favorite Black Sabbath songs of all time. So this being on this really brings the entire collection up. Interesting note, we talked about this last week when we talked about if you've never heard Mob Rules with its intro E5150, then you haven't really heard the Mob Rules in its best form. Interestingly enough, in the movie, they also play E5150 and the Mob Rules together. But on the soundtrack, they leave off E5150 and just play the Mob Rules. Who knows why? Again, this is one of the strangest set of music and ever in the history of music. But very interestingly, this is the final big scene with the Valkyrie and the evil forces coming into war. And you can barely hear E5150, but it's there. And then Mob Rules. At least they have one heavy metal song on the heavy metal soundtrack. And it is, they at least picked a good one. Check it out. The Mob Rules. One of the more underrated songs on this album is called Prefabricated by a band by the name of Trust. If you're thinking to yourself, Trust, that name sounds familiar. They're a French metal band, hard rock band, kind of punk band. But why you may have heard of them is because this is the band that gave us Nico McBrain of Iron Maiden fame. So famously, Trust and Iron Maiden were doing some touring apparently, and Steve Harris took a liking to Nico McBrain and decided to bring him into the Maiden fold. Nico and Steve became fast friends, and the rest is history. Oddly enough, Clive Burr, who was in Maiden, then goes into Trust for a little bit. So they just kind of swap places, but he doesn't stay there very long. So yeah, Trust. Again, how did these people find these bands? I have no idea. Now we're bringing in French heavy metal bands. Most of the music Trust had done at that point was in their native French language. This one is in English, but again, some of the obscure bands that these people selected for this soundtrack, it's amazing. Trust, right up there. Finally, a female voice to end it off, and one of the best, Stevie Nicks, with the song Blue Lamp. Now, Stevie Nicks had just left Fleetwood Mac and was just about to launch a very successful solo career. So much like Sammy Hagar, Stevie Nicks, although very much a household name, is really kicking off a new chapter of her career here as she is going to go on and put out some really big solo albums in the early 80s. She did, the infamous duo with Tom Petty, One Winged Dove. She's going to go into the stratosphere. But this is right before she's about to break big. So, again, lots of different bands here and lots of different places in their career. Stevie Nicks about to go huge as a big solo star. So there you have it. A lot of different songs, a lot of different music, some mellow, some heavy, some hard rock, some obscure bands, some legendary bands in their last days, some legendary bands just about to get started. This soundtrack has a little bit for everybody, but I will say this. Give this soundtrack a listen. Again, probably buried in the sands of time. You can even probably find the movie if you dare. Not really a good movie, but one that is a cult classic. Go check it out. It was definitely a very different experience in 1981. But let's not let this derail us from what we're talking about today. We're talking about the best hard rock songs of 1981, and you want to hear this list. It is one great track after another, and even a few honorable mentions that are excellent. Let's get controversial right off the bat. Nominee number 1 for Best Hard Rock Song of the Year, Dirty Deeds, Done Dirt Cheap, AC/DC. So let's go back to 1981 for a second. In 1980, Back in Black had become a huge album for the time. It's probably like over 20 million copies sold now, but at the time it had already sold 5 million just in that first year. And that was unheard of back then. That was a really big album back in those days. And so the people who owned the rights to AC/DC realized that there was an Australian album that was released in 1976 that had never been released in the States. Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap was the name of the album. And it went back to their former lead singer, the recently deceased Bon Scott. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this because, number one, it was released in 1976. Number two, the lead singer of the band is no longer with the band. And many people within the AC/DC camp say this album really messed everything up because now, instead of having momentum for Brian Johnson, who's now taking charge and having this big hit, Back in Black, instead of focusing on the follow-up, now people are confused and going back into the AC/DC catalog. Many people think it really hurt the sales for the next AC/DC album with Brian Johnson. I would probably agree with that. I was new to AC/DC. I had purchased Back in Black. That was my first AC/DC album. I went out shortly thereafter and got Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, and was I surprised because the two singers, Bon Scott and Brian Johnson, could not sound different. And at that point, I was like, what is this? What's going on? And that's when I was just like everybody else. I went back into the catalog, found Highway to Hell, found Let There Be Rock, and really spent most of my time and energy digging through their older stuff rather than anticipating the next newer album they produced. So they made lots of money, but as one person said, it was an awfully crass marketing move that got them there. But you can't deny our first nominee is a real banger, the title track, Dirty Deeds, Done Dirt Cheap. Now, it did derail things, but AC/DC did later that year put out their second album with Brian Johnson. And while I think the album paled in comparison to Back in Black, the title track is excellent. For those about to rock, we salute you. This is an absolutely great song by AC/DC. Probably the best song that they produced after Back in Black in the entire catalog. It is one of the staples of an AC/DC show. If you go see AC/DC live, they're going to play this song and they're going to shoot off cannons and you're going to love every minute of it. Really great song. Had to be also on the list. So there's two AC/DC songs in 1981 off two separate albums with two separate singers. There you go. Nominee number 2 for Those About to Rock by AC/DC. We talked about this band a little bit on the heavy metal soundtrack. Blue Oyster Cult comes in as our third nominee with their big hit, Burning for You. I would say that Blue Oyster Cult is one of those bands that was hit or miss for me. But when they hit, they had such an ability to not just hit in the metal community, but have a big hit across the board. Burning for You is a huge hit. If you turn on classic rock radio right now, you're probably going to hear Don't Fear the Reaper, Burning for You. Those two songs in particular. Godzilla, another big hit for the band. When they hit, boy, they went into the stratosphere. and this is an excellent song. Blue Oyster Cult, again, very eccentric, but they could string together a melody like nobody could in this era of music. Very good. Our third nominee, Burning for You, Blue Oyster Cult. Our fourth nominee might be a little controversial, as I'm placing them in the hard rock category because they're one of the stalwarts for the new wave of British heavy metal. But I always thought Def Leppard was a little bit more hard rock than pure heavy metal, so they're going to go in the hard rock category with one of their best songs, a ballad/instrumental called Bringin' on the Heartbreak, Switch 625. Again, I put these two together because it's like peanut butter and jelly. You have this great ballad with all this intensity, and then it kind of rounds off to this tremendous way to finish off the side of the album with this great instrumental. I have my druthers with, Def Leppard really goes in a commercial bent after this, but this is still a very heavy version of Def Leppard. Pete Willis on guitar. Ooh, this is a good one. You could pick any song off this album, by the way. I picked this one, largely because it was a very popular song on this album, but also with that instrumental at the end of it really has an epic feel to it. But boy, there's great song after great song on this High and Dry album. So our fourth nominee, Def Leppard, with Bringin' on the Heartbreak, Switch 625. Our fifth and final nominee, we talked about him a couple of weeks ago, Motley Crue, the newcomers, with their song Live Wire. You can go through the entire Motley Crue catalog and not find a banger like this one. Live Wire is fantastic. It's their very first hit. They have the first video for this, lighting Nikki Sixx on fire, the whole works. This is classic Motley Crue. And again, this could probably go into the heavy metal category if you so choose. It's one of the heavier Motley Crue songs. But I've always looked at that whole California glam metal as more hard rock than metal. So I, again, sticking it in here as one of the best hard rock songs of the year, and rounding out our category with Live Wire by Motley Crue. And the winner is Before I announce the winner, let's go through a few of the honorable mentions. Songs I really loved from 1981 that just got edged out, maybe even had them in the top 5 for a bit as I was maneuvering through this. Angel of Death by Thin Lizzy, one of my favorite. Thin Lizzy's starting to get a little heavier towards the end of their career. This is a very good Thin Lizzy song. Just Between You and Me, the biggest hit from the Canadian powerhouse April Wine, comes out in 1981. Diary of a Working Man. We're going to talk a little bit about this. I've kind of avoided Southern rock. We talked about it a little bit in the early 70s, but as the 70s progressed, I kind of moved away from Southern rock. But this, Blackfoot, has to be mentioned. They are one of the heaviest Southern rock bands and one of the best. Really love this song. A ballad off their album Marauder. Can't Happen Here. We've now moved into the third version of Rainbow, much more commercial than the Dio years, even the Graham Bonnet years. We've moved into the Joe Lynn Turner era. Joe Lynn Turner, a very underrated singer. This is a really good Rainbow song. It was thought quite highly of. Ooh, these last two, though, these were hard to leave out because these are some of the best songs ever. Tom Sawyer by Rush. 2112 is always going to be my favorite song of theirs, but Tom Sawyer, right up there among the best. They're having their biggest album, Moving Pictures. Fantastic song by Rush. And Unchained by Van Halen. They've finally gotten bumped out of the hard rock song category, but only because of stellar competition. Unchained, one of the best, most energetic Van Halen songs on the catalog. Ooh, those last two, hard to keep them off the nominee list. But the winner, let's get to that. AC/DC, Dirty Deeds, done dirt cheap. Crass marketing move or not, this song has always been amongst my absolute favorite AC/DC songs. So characteristic of Bon Scott. One of the funny stories as I was researching this, I'd never really paid much attention to it, but apparently there was a show that Angus Young used to watch as a kid, like a cartoon show, where there was a spy or whatever who would do the dirty deeds. He had his little card. That was kind of inspired this. What a great song. Still one of the biggest songs on the AC/DC playlist. Even though Bon Scott was the original lead singer, Brian Johnson sings this beautifully. It is an absolute banger and really, signifies that AC/DC energy of the late 70s, early 80s. That was why everybody fell in love with them. What a great song. And hey, it wins in a year, like I just said. Tons of competition. All of these songs are great. Now there were songs on honorable mention that could have won this thing. What a year for hard rock. And next week, we're going to talk about the hard rock albums, and the competition is pretty fierce there as well. But that does it for this week. If you are new to the channel, do me a favor, subscribe. Go into the comments section. Tell me what you think was the best hard rock song of 1981. And become a member. Hit the like button. Subscribe. Ring the bell. All the things that YouTube loves for you to do. And feed the algorithm, folks. It helps this channel. We're just a little over a year old at this point, and we need all the support we can get. But in the meantime, again, next week we're going to be talking about the best hard rock albums, and then we're going to move into the great heavy metal songs and albums of 1981. So you want to make sure you don't miss an episode. We're here every Tuesday. Come check us out. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.